I grew up in Clover Falls, Tennessee, a town small enough that everybody knew your middle name and your business before you did. The kind of place where the Baptist church on Main Street had the same 3 families in the front pew every single Sunday, where the diner on the corner served the same peach cobbler recipe for 40 years, and where a woman's worth was quietly, consistently measured by how well she kept her mouth shut and her family's secrets intact. My name is Claire. And for the first 29 years of my life, I was very, very good at keeping secrets. I was the daughter who stayed. My older sister, Danielle, left for Atlanta at 18 and never looked back. She built a life that looked glossy from the outside. A condo downtown, a boyfriend who wore expensive watches, a social media feed full of rooftop parties and restaurant openings. My parents talked about Danielle the way people talk about a painting they're proud to own. They pointed at her whenever company came over. They framed her college graduation photo in the living room and left mine in the drawer. I was the one who drove my mother to her doctor appointments. I was the one who fixed the leaking pipe under the kitchen sink because my father said he'd get to it and never did. I was the one who sat at the kitchen table every night after my accounting job and helped my parents go through their bills, renegotiate their insurance, file their taxes correctly for the first time in a decade. I did it quietly. I did it without being asked. I did it because I genuinely loved them, and because somewhere deep down I believed that love, given consistently enough, would eventually be returned in kind. I was wrong about that. The night everything broke open started like an ordinary Thursday. I came home from work to find Danielle's car in the driveway, a rental, expensive, silver, which was already unusual because Danielle only came home when she needed something. I walked through the front door and found my parents sitting at the dining room table with Danielle across from them, all 3 of them holding papers I didn't recognize. They looked up at me the way people look up when someone interrupts a conversation they weren't supposed to hear. My father cleared his throat. He said they needed to talk to me. Danielle had an opportunity. A real one, he said. She'd been offered a chance to co-invest in a business venture in Atlanta, something to do with a boutique event space, and it was going to require some startup capital that she didn't have liquid right now. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over Danielle's. They'd decided, my father said, that the right thing to do, the family thing to do, was to refinance the house to help cover it. The house I'd been helping them pay the mortgage on for 3 years. I sat down slowly. I asked questions the way I'd been trained to ask them, carefully, without accusation. I asked about the business plan. I asked about projected returns. I asked whether anyone had had an attorney review the investment documents. Danielle looked at me the way she'd looked at me since we were children, like I was a small inconvenience she'd learned to step around. She said I was being negative. My mother agreed. My father said this was already decided and he was just letting me know as a courtesy. A courtesy. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at the wall for a long time. I thought about the 3 years of Saturdays I'd spent helping my father clean the gutters, repaint the garage, replace the water heater. I thought about the $4,000 I'd quietly added to their savings account 2 Christmases ago without saying a word, because I knew they were short. I thought about every birthday Danielle sent a card that arrived late, every Thanksgiving she had a reason she couldn't make it, every phone call my mother made to me that started with, "I know you're busy, but..." I got up. I washed my face. I went back downstairs, and I told my parents calmly that I didn't think this was a sound financial decision, and I would not be able to continue contributing to the household expenses if they moved forward with a refinance that put the property at risk. My mother's face changed in a way I hadn't seen before, tight and cold and final. My father said that if I felt that way, maybe it was time I found my own place. Danielle said nothing. She just looked at her nails. I went back upstairs. I took my time. I packed a bag with 3 days' worth of clothes, my laptop, my work files, my passport, my mother's old jewelry box that she told me years ago would be mine someday. I packed it because something in me knew, with the particular clarity that only comes after a long time of not seeing, that tonight was a door closing. I came downstairs. I put my key on the kitchen counter. I said goodnight. Nobody answered. It was raining when I got to my car. A real Tennessee rain, the kind that doesn't apologize, that comes sideways and soaks you before you've made it 3 steps. I drove without a destination for about 20 minutes, and then I pulled into the parking lot of Second Grace Community Church because the lights were still on and I needed somewhere dry to think. The side door was unlocked. I slipped in through the back. The sanctuary was empty and quiet and smelled like candle wax and old wood, and I sat down in the last pew and I put my head in my hands and I let myself cry for exactly 7 minutes. I know it was 7 minutes because I watched the second hand on the clock above the choir loft. I gave myself those 7 minutes, and then I stopped, because I had always believed that falling apart was something you could schedule if you had enough discipline. I didn't hear her come in. I became aware of her the way you become aware of weather, a shift in the air, a sense of presence before you register the details. When I turned, there was a woman standing in the side aisle, maybe 65, in a rain jacket over what were clearly very expensive clothes, holding a small umbrella that had done her very little good. She had my grandmother's cheekbones. I hadn't seen my father's sister in 11 years. My Aunt Ruth looked at me for a long moment. Then she sat down in the pew directly in front of mine, turned sideways so she could see me, and said, "You have your grandmother's face when she was angry. She always cried when she was angry too. She'd have hated for anyone to know that." I hadn't spoken to Aunt Ruth since I was 18. She and my father had a falling out that nobody in our family discussed in complete sentences. She'd moved to Charleston, made money in commercial real estate. How much money, exactly, was a topic that made my father's jaw tighten whenever it came up. My mother called her difficult. Danielle called her that woman. I had thought about her occasionally over the years with the vague, unresolved feeling you have about a book you never finished. She asked me what happened. I told her. I didn't editorialize. I gave her the facts in the order they occurred, the way I'd been trained to present financial reports cleanly, without emotional inflation, letting the numbers speak. She listened without interrupting, which was more than most people had ever done. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out a card, a plain card, cream-colored, with her name and a phone number handwritten on it, and she held it out to me. She said, "I'm in town for a week. I'm staying at the Hargrove Inn. Come for breakfast tomorrow if you want. Come or don't. But if you come ready to talk about what you actually want your life to look like." She stood up, smoothed her jacket, and walked back out through the side door. The rain had stopped. I sat in that pew for another hour, turning the card over in my hands. I came for breakfast. Ruth Calloway, she used her married name still, even though she'd been widowed 12 years, occupied a corner suite at the Hargrove Inn, and had apparently made herself a regular in the 3 days she'd been in town, because the waitstaff knew her coffee order. She had a yellow legal pad on the table when I arrived, and a pen in her hand, and she looked like someone who had spent decades making decisions that other people then had to live with. She asked me about my work first. I was a senior accountant at a regional firm, 3 years in, strong reviews, underpaid by about 15% relative to market, because I'd never pushed back on my initial offer and had missed 2 cycles of raises by being too quiet. She wrote things down. She asked about my certifications, my software proficiency, what I wanted to be doing in 5 years. I told her I'd always wanted to start my own practice, small, specialized, focused on helping family-owned businesses, the kind that got into trouble not because they weren't profitable, but because nobody had ever sat down and explained the numbers to them in plain language. She stopped writing. She looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. She said, "Your father told everyone I was difficult because I told him the truth about money. In our family, telling the truth about money is the only unforgivable sin." She slid the legal pad across the table. There was a number on it. She said she'd been looking for the right place to put a specific amount of capital for 3 years. A minority stake in a small, specialized financial services firm. Not a controlling interest, she was explicit about that, just enough to get it started properly. She said she wasn't doing it as charity. She said she'd be a demanding partner who expected quarterly reports and transparent books and clear-eyed assessments of what wasn't working. She said she would not be doing it because I was family. She'd be doing it because in 20 minutes of listening to me talk about accounting, she'd heard more original thinking than she'd heard from the 3 other candidates her advisor had pitched to her over the past year. I asked her why she was in Clover Falls in the first place. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I come back every November. I visit your grandmother's grave. I've been doing it alone for 11 years. She paused. "I saw you drive past the cemetery yesterday. I followed you to the church." There was a long silence. I picked up my coffee. I said, I want to read a term sheet before I agree to anything." She smiled for the first time. It looked like it was something her face didn't do automatically, but when it arrived, it was genuine. She said, "Good. I had my attorney draw one up this morning." The next 11 months were the hardest I'd ever worked and the most alive I'd ever felt. I sublet a studio apartment 2 miles from my old office, furnished it with a second-hand couch and a very good desk, and registered Callaway Parish Financial Services LLC on a Tuesday afternoon with my hands shaking slightly over the keyboard. Ruth transferred the startup capital in 2 tranches as agreed, with documentation so clean it was almost affectionate. I brought on 1 part-time associate, a young woman named Sasha who had a finance degree and a gift for explaining amortization schedules to people who'd never heard the word before. Our first 3 clients were family-owned businesses within 30 miles of Clover Falls. A furniture maker who didn't know he was technically insolvent on paper despite a full order book. A flower farm run by 2 sisters who were unknowingly double-paying their crop insurance. A restaurant that had been leaving money in a non-interest-bearing account for 6 years out of habit. Within 9 months, all 3 were in better financial shape than they'd been in years, and all 3 sent referrals. I didn't call my parents. I didn't avoid the topic if it came up, but I didn't reach out. I was not angry, or rather, I was angry, but I treated my anger the way I treated all my emotions, as information to be processed rather than weather to be survived. I had made my choices, they had made theirs. I heard through a cousin that the refinance had gone through, that Danielle's business venture had, within 4 months, run into problems she described as her partner's fault, that my father had taken on a second part-time job to cover the new mortgage. I heard this and I felt something complicated, not satisfaction, which would have been ugly, but a grief that things had not been different, that the version of events I'd hoped for as a child had not materialized. I let myself feel it on a Sunday afternoon and then I filed it and went back to work on Monday. Ruth came to Charleston for a long weekend in June. We had dinner twice and walked along the Battery in the evenings talking about the business and, gradually, about other things, her marriage, her early years, what it had been like to be the sister who left. She was not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She did not dispense comfort freely, but she was relentlessly honest in a way that I had been starving for my entire life without knowing it, and I found that honesty more nourishing than warmth had ever been. On the last evening, she told me something. She said that my grandmother, before she died, had changed her will. Not dramatically, the family home and the bulk of the estate had gone to my father as expected. But there was a separate instrument, a trust, modest in size but structured carefully, that had been designated for the grandchild who demonstrates, through action rather than declaration, that she understands what this family should have been. Ruth had been named trustee. The trust had been sitting inactive for 7 years, waiting. She said my grandmother had talked about me in the last years of her life, had asked Ruth, who visited twice a year quietly and without announcement, about me specifically, had said she worried I was too good at being invisible. I looked at the water for a moment. I asked Ruth why she hadn't told me about the trust 11 months ago, at the Hargrove Inn. She said, "Because 11 months ago I needed to know if you'd build something without it. Anyone can perform when there's money on the table. I needed to know what you did when there wasn't." The trust was not enough to change the shape of my life. It was not that kind of money. But it was enough to pay off the startup debt ahead of schedule, enough to hire Sasha full-time, enough to move into a proper office with a conference room and a glass door with our name on it. It was, more than anything, evidence. Evidence that one person in my family had seen me clearly when I was not performing for anyone, had thought about me in a room alone and decided I was worth designating something to. I cried in my car for exactly 7 minutes. Then I went inside and got back to work. My mother called me in September. I don't know how she got the office number. Probably the cousin, probably Google. I answered because I had decided months earlier that I would, if she called, because I am my mother's daughter in the specific sense that I believe in completing things. The call was short. She said she'd heard I was doing well. I said I was. She said Danielle was going through a difficult time. I said I was sorry to hear that. She said she didn't know if I'd ever understand how hard it was to be in the middle. I said I understood it very well, actually. There was a silence that had years in it. She asked if we could have lunch. I said yes. Not because the wound was closed, it wasn't, but because I had learned somewhere in the past year, that keeping a door permanently sealed was its own kind of cost, and I had gotten very precise about what I was and wasn't willing to spend. We had lunch. It was careful and short, and we talked about surface things, and at the end she looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something that might have been recognition, and she said, "You're different." I said, "I'm the same. You're just seeing me for the first time." I drove back to the office. Sasha had left a note on my desk about a new inquiry, a third-generation hardware store with a succession problem and no clear plan. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down and started reading. This is the thing they don't tell you about being the one who stays, who helps, who does the quiet work without asking for credit. They don't tell you that those years aren't lost. They're training. Every leaking pipe you fixed, every bill you sorted through, every uncomfortable truth you delivered in a calm voice, because you'd learned that calm was the only register anyone actually heard. All of it was preparation for the moment when someone finally gave you a room of your own and said, "Show me what you know." My grandmother knew. She'd left me the only inheritance that actually transfers not money, not property, but the unambiguous proof that someone who was watching carefully believed the answer was yes. I keep her trust document in the top drawer of my desk. Not framed, not displayed, just there. On the days when a client calls to say something isn't working, or a number doesn't come out right, or the business feels too big or too small or too something, I pull open that drawer and I look at it for about 30 seconds. Then I close the drawer and I get back to work. That's what she would have wanted. That's what we both would have wanted, together, if she'd had more time and I'd had the sense to stop being invisible sooner. But we have the time we're given, and I have learned finally to use mine.